In the previous video, we looked at how an increase in the money supply would cause interest rates to go down, investment spending to go up, and aggregate demand to increase, and therefore make prices go up and real GDP to increase as well. Now, how much of an impact a change in money supply has on the economy in terms of changing that real GDP depends on whether you are a Keynesian or a monetarist. So we have Keynesian schools of thought and the monetarist school of thought. And the monetarist school of thought is led by an individual, or founded really by an individual, named Milton Friedman. So let's look at the different philosophies, the Keynesian and the monetarists, and how they disagree. Okay? So the monetarists believe that an increase in the money supply has a much bigger impact on GDP than the Keynesians. If you'll recall, John Maynard Keynes was not a big fan of monetary policy, right? The whole Keynesian approach to fixing unemployment is fiscal policy. Changing taxes, changing government spending, because Keynes believed that would have a much greater impact than changing the money supply. John Maynard Keynes also didn't trust banks and bankers at the time to make the right decisions for the economy. So it's the monetarists who believe that changing the money supply will have a much bigger impact on how the economy is doing. And it really comes down to the idea of the velocity of money. The velocity of money is the number of times in a year that the average unit of currency is spent. So in Canada, if we're looking at a loonie, for example, how often in a year does a single loonie get spent? Okay, so as we look at that, so we look at the size of our economy, our nominal GDP, we can measure nominal GDP in two different ways. So we looked before at measuring nominal GDP in terms of price times the number of goods sold. So when we did that, we found that nominal GDP, for our pizza and calzones example, was when we took the 20 pizzas times their price of $12 a piece, and we added that to the 30 calzones sold at $6 a piece, and we found that the size of the economy in this example was 420. Well, we can also measure the size of the economy in terms of the amount of money in circulation times the velocity of money, the number of times that the dollars get spent. So for example, if we have $84 in circulation, we could actually figure out how many times each of those dollars gets spent, because in this economy, we spent a total of $420 on pizza and calzones. So we have what is called the equation of exchange. The equation of exchange says you can take the amount of money in circulation, so the money supply, times the velocity, the number of times it gets spent, and we can have that be equal to the number of goods sold times the price they're sold for. So in this case, if price times quantity means that our nominal GDP is 420, we have 420 equals the amount of money in circulation times the velocity, and we know that in this example there's $84 in the money supply. So then the question is, how often does each dollar get spent? Well, if we bought $420 worth of goods with $84 in circulation, then the velocity of money would be the $420 divided by the $84. And when we do that, we find out that each dollar in this economy is spent 5 times. So in order to buy $420 worth of pizza and calzones, each dollar of the $84 in circulation has to be spent 5 times. So now if we look at the monetarists assume that the velocity of money doesn't change. It's constant. So if you look back at the equation of exchange, so M times V equals P times Q, if we increase the money supply, so let's say we print more bills, so money supply goes up, and the velocity of money doesn't change, then that means that price times quantity, our nominal GDP, has to go up. Because if we take 84 times 5, so remember 84 times 5 was 420, and you increase the money supply, let's suppose we increase the money supply by 50 bucks. Okay, so the money supply is now 84 plus 50. We now have $134 in circulation. If that $134 each gets spent 5 times, well, 134 times 5, our nominal GDP is now 670. So if the velocity of money is constant, if it doesn't change, then increasing the money supply grows the economy. We added 50 bucks to the money supply, and nominal GDP went from 420 to 670, which is, what is that? That's an increase of 670 minus 420. That's an increase of 250 bucks. Well, where did this 250 bucks extra come from? It was the 50 extra dollars, each being spent 5 times. So if we increase the money supply by 50 bucks, nominal GDP increases by our velocity of money, which was 5, times 50 bucks, or $250. So according to the monetarists, you can grow the economy by growing the money supply. You make the money supply go up, it makes nominal GDP go up. Okay. And that's because the monetarists believe the velocity of money doesn't change. Okay. Now, it's important to note that if the economy is already at full employment. Okay, so what does that mean, full employment? Well, if we're at full employment, then that means our unemployment rate is between 4 and 6.4%. We're at our natural rate of unemployment, so there's no cyclical. If you're at that point, then not only is the velocity of money constant, but the quantity that we produce is constant as well. So think about it this way. If we're at full employment, we're already producing the maximum amount we can. We're already buying the maximum amount we can. In which case, so let's go back to our formula, M times V equals P times Q. If the velocity of money doesn't change and the quantity of money doesn't change, then when you increase the money supply, it just increases prices. So the monetarist does not advocate that we increase the money supply if we're at full employment. Okay? If the economy is already at full employment, don't increase the money supply, because all it's going to lead to is if you double the money supply, you're going to have double the inflation. But when you do increase the money supply is when we're not at full employment. So when we have cyclical employment, when the economy is contracting, if you increase the money supply, according to the monetarist, it will grow the economy. And that's because of this velocity of money, and the fact that we spend each dollar multiple times, and according to the monetarist, that doesn't change from year to year. So if you add more money, it'll get spent the same number of times as all the other bills, and it'll grow the economy. So are the monetarists right? What's been happening with the velocity of money in Canada? So when you think about money, how often do you think it gets spent? So we could look at M1, we could look at M2. So let's start with M1. So if you think about the money that's in your checking account and your banknotes and your coins, how often do you think in a year that money gets spent? So if you have a loonie right now in your wallet, how many times this year has that loonie been spent? Well, if we look at the velocity of money for Canada, when it comes to M1, the velocity of money is about 3. So the typical banknote, so we're looking at an average of all the 10s, 20s, $5 bills, as well as your loonies and your toonies, gets spent about 3 times a year. Now maybe the coin in your pocket has been spent more than that, but then there's also the money that grandma has stashed in her house that hasn't moved for decades. So on average, a coin or a banknote in Canada gets spent about 3 times a year. If we look instead at the velocity of M2, so what was an M2? M2 was everything in M1, so that's your banknotes, your coins, money in your checking account, so your demand deposits, and then M2 also included what? Includes notice deposits. And what were notice deposits? That's money in your savings account. So if you look at money in your savings account, as well as your cash and the money in your checking account, then the velocity of money is closer to 1. That is, if you include the money in your savings account, a typical dollar gets spent once a year. Because a lot of money we put into our savings account sits there for years. So on average, we spend the money once a year. And you can look here, this graph goes, I think, from 2009 back to 1974, and you can see in the last, basically 2000 to 2010, the velocity of money has essentially leveled off. Prior to that, it was declining. Now, related to the velocity of money is the idea of Cambridge K. Cambridge K is the average length of time a dollar is held before being spent. So if our velocity of money is 5, so a typical dollar gets spent 5 times in a year, then Cambridge K is 1 divided by 5. And so that's saying that each dollar is held for 20% of the year. If we multiply that times 365, we find that we're holding money on average for 73 days. So in our pizza and calzone example, Cambridge K is 1 over 5, and that's equivalent of 73 days. Now we said that in Canada, M1 has a velocity of 3. So Cambridge K would be 1/3 of a year. And so we can take 1/3 times 365. So 365 times 1/3, which is what, 121.6. So we can see that if your velocity of money is 3, then the typical dollar is going to be held for 122 days. So the higher the velocity, what happens to the length of time you hold the money? So the higher the velocity, the shorter the time we hold the money. The lower the velocity, so each dollar is spent less in a year, the longer the time period we're holding the dollar. So we have to start to think about what causes the length of time that we hold money to change. Okay? And so we think about what is our demand for money. Okay? So remember, we need money to buy groceries, and we demand more cash when prices go up, and we demand more cash when the economy grows. When we see inflation, then more of your money goes to buy goods and services, so you probably hold on to it for a shorter period of time, which means that the velocity goes up, we get spent more often, and Cambridge K, the length of time you hold a dollar, goes down.